Hi, my name is Dan, and this video is one in a series of videos that I'm doing on combat in video games as part of a wider suite of videos that I'm doing on game design. And in this video, singular, we're going to focus in a bit on the second-to-second play, particularly in melee combat. Okay, so players spend a lot of time in combat, or they certainly do in games where fighting is involved. It's a large part of the gameplay of many games. So my encouragement to you potentially as a budding game designer is get it right. It's worth spending time on what feels like quite a small aspect in terms of time that's going to be repeated over and over again, and getting the feel of this so that it works for your game, whatever your game is. So I'm going to play a couple of clips now. The first is from Street Fighter V, and which is a game, and the second is from a film, which is Undisputed 2: Last Man Standing, I believe. And I particularly, as you're watching this, I'd like you to think about the flow. So that's how the speed changes during the combat, and the rhythm, and how the combat sits in a rhythm of its own, and so the feel of the combat with the two. And there are similarities and there are differences between the two. So here they come. So thinking about the differences, this isn't just about these two clips, but in a wider sense, the differences between fighting, melee fighting in films, and melee combat in games. So film combat tends to be longer. Beat 'em ups are somewhat an exception for this, is that combat and beat 'em ups can be quite a protracted thing, deliberately. But in general, you find that a fighting sequence in a film is often quite a lot longer than you would expect to spend in a single combat experience in a game. And alongside that, you would expect to have many more fights in a game than you might have in a film. You've also got in the film, certainly in the clip that we showed, you've got reactions from watchers, and that's very common in film to have some form of reaction shot, which is often is a thing that they do in films to kind of seed the reactions from the audience, is to show them people inside the film world reacting, and that sets a model for how the audience should be reacting to what they're seeing on the screen. It ebbs and flows more. I don't know if you noticed that in the two clips that we've got, is that it has more of this kind of speed up and slow down than you would experience or tend to find in game combat. And perhaps less so between these two clips, because Street Fighter V is obviously tied into a storyline, but often in games, a single combat doesn't have the same significance for the story as it does in a film. And part of this is because you have many more combat experiences in the game, and you can't necessarily make each one such a significant point. Maybe your bosses are in a game. Um, okay, so going to think about timing now a little bit, and how this is kind of tied in at the core of combat, certainly of melee combat. And you have the player action, and usually this takes time, or it may have a cooldown. Um, and you might also have the timing of reactions to whatever the enemy's doing. So as they attack, you might have chances to dodge or parry. So that's again to do with timing and the reactions from the player to be able to pick up on the fact that the enemy is about to do something they need to block. So there are three factors that control the timing in combat. So one is how the player attacks, uh, so how they're actually going to go about attacking. The second is how the enemy attacks, obviously these two things, but also when the enemy attacks and how they space out their attacks, whether they're going to just spam attack all the time, or are they going to look for opportunities? Are they going to pause? Are they going to have flurries and things like that, which can change the feel of the combat over time? Um, so I want to quickly talk about the animations that you might have. So in a single person game, or in fact in any game where you can actually see the combatants, you're likely to have combat animations. And this is often part of the designer's job to be thinking about how the animation works. It needs to be fluid and believable in combat for that combat experience to feel um, as it should do in melee combat. It should have that kind of up close and personal feel, and the fluidity and believability of the animation are quite important in terms of making this feel real. Or to put it another way, if it isn't fluid and believable, that will disconnect the player from the feelings that you want them to have as they're engaged in combat. And typically in the animation phases for combat, you'll have three phases, which are the pre-contact, so this is winding up to connect through. Then you've got the contact phase, which is where the actual hit happens. Then you've got a post-contact. And so there are, as I said, three phases, but it gets more complicated than this, which I'm not going to go into, because as you chain attacks, you might not be doing all three of these separately, and you might have an intermediate um, animation that goes from between contacts, from one contact to another. You might be switching hands if you're punching, so you might have a left-right kind of thing, and it gets more and more complicated the deeper you go into it, and the better your animations are for combat. Yeah. So we're going to look at some stuff for a simple beat 'em up now. Thinking about this is about the effects in combat of different attacks. So beat 'em ups tend to have several different attacks that you can use, and here's um, a table that has been created, which is looking at a grid between the player action. And here in this particular game, we've got a light action, a heavy action, a kick, a counter attack, and a dragon punch, which is a special kind of attack. May have been built up by using combos, not quite sure. And the enemy states can be in various different states: idle, attacking, blocking, covering, or crouching. You can read, I hope, as well. And so the different outcomes, uh, depending on the what the player chooses to do and the enemy states, are shown on this table. And this is the kind of thing that's really useful for the developers to be able to break this down, and then you might break this down further, as we were talking about animation a few seconds ago, to actually build in, which animations need to go where in your games design. Um, and then finally, I want to talk about combos. I'm hopefully stating the obvious here. Um, Sometimes it depends on your game. Sometimes games present this idea of a fighting combo, which is where you get advantages for doing things in a row. So sometimes this is controlled by having multiple button presses before the action. So you have to press several buttons. Again, this might be a typical thing in some beat 'em ups. Yeah, you do various. So it's a combination of buttons, really, or controls. You chain them up, and then this produces a special attack. But the other approach to combos is that you might have timed button presses during the action. So as you're hitting, you might have to hit several things in a row in the right kind of timing to set up your final combo attack. So, finally, I want to ask the question, what about ranged combat? So, we've really focused in on melee combat. Some of the same things apply in ranged combat, but ranged combat tends to be less complex. You're less likely to have things like combos. Uh, your animations, maybe you've got similar things, but you're less likely to be chaining attacks. Um, if you're shooting, that's different from if you're throwing and or using a bow. There's more animation involved in those kind of weapons. Shooting, yeah, you've probably got some. If you're in a first-person shooter, then typically you don't actually see much in the way of animation from the player anyway. Um, and as I said, the focus for the timing is very important in melee combat. It can be for the ranged combat. The control of the flow and the timing is maybe somewhat different in ranged combat and potentially less important. It's more kind of controlled by the player and at a slightly higher level, I would say. Uh, anyway, this was meant to be a focus more on melee combat rather than range combat, but I thought I'd throw that question at the end. But that's it from me for now.